Welcome to Humanities Online. This is a lecture dealing with America's political systems. It's meant to introduce you to the reading you're going to do this week in the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. So we're going to be looking at the question of how revolutionary was the American Revolution. And in my attempt to be funny, I have subtitled this lecture, The United States, a Paine in the Burke. And this is in part because we have read a great deal of Paine and Burke, and I'm hoping that you will think about those ideas as you read through Americans' differing visions for their government and their views of how revolutionary one form of government over another was. So sit tight. This lecture is going to be about 20 minutes long, and we'll get through some material and introduce you to the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So in terms of what you'll be reading this week, you're going to be reading a debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists about the structure, function, and purpose of the United States government. The Federalists, represented in our reading by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, they are advocating for a stronger central government, and in general, especially Hamilton, really sees the future of the country resting on the development of the merchant and manufacturing economy. He's also somebody who is ambitious about having a government eventually that is capable of having a proud standing in world affairs. The Anti-Federalists are going to be people who are suspicious of having a stronger central government. They are folks who prefer to have an agrarian-based economy. And so they're going to argue that creating a stronger central government takes away from the liberty of the people. Why is this debate occurring? Well, instead of revising our first form of government, the Articles of Confederation, which did end up having several weaknesses, the delegates who met in Philadelphia ended up devising a whole new constitution. And so the debate that occurs between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists really has to do with the ratification of this constitution. In terms of when and where this debate occurs, it is occurring in 1788. The Constitution had emerged in 1787 as a plan, and now the states have to make the decision about whether or not to ratify it. According to the terms of the Constitution, only 9 states needed to ratify the Constitution for it to go into effect. And in 1788, 8 states had done so, but New York and Virginia, the two biggest states in terms of population and wealth, had yet to ratify the Constitution. And proponents of the Constitution understood that even if there had been a 9th state to ratify the Constitution, if the Constitution did not have the backing of the 2 most important states, then it really had very little legitimacy. And so the Federalists are working hard by way of New York newspapers to write a series of essays explaining and defending the various features of this Constitution. And so as we are reading this debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, it might be helpful in some ways to think about the Anti-Federalists being most closely aligned with the ideas of Thomas Paine, a radical reformer, whereas the Federalists are moving slightly away from the ideas of Thomas Paine and moving in a slightly more conservative direction. I would not say that they could be considered Burkean per se, but that will be something that you should think about as you're reading the Anti-Federalists versus the Federalists. So, as you are thinking through the ideas of the Federalists, Anti-Federalists, it might be helpful just to remind ourselves what the ideas of Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke were. So very quickly, Thomas Paine, as you well remember, advocates for no monarchy. He is somebody who believes that we have inalienable or created rights. Every age and generation, he says, must be free to act for itself. He believes in a clear separation of church and state. He tends to be more in favor of revolutions, and he's someone who's very much indebted to Enlightenment theories, such as those of John Locke, who is really, in some ways, an important forefather, who is the person that everybody kind of goes back to in terms of the new Republican forms of government and those kinds of ideas. On the other side, we have Edmund Burke, our conservative, who will argue against Thomas Paine by saying that a monarchical form of government, especially as we see it in Britain, has worked well, that rights have a historical legacy, we have an obligation to the past, there shouldn't be a separation of church and state, and probably most important in terms of many of our discussions, he believes that revolutions are not necessarily great and we should change with caution. And so this is where we talked about the metaphor of home building. So he is somebody who believes in remodeling rather than starting fresh. So no tear downs for Edmund Burke, but more of a remodeling approach to home improvement. And the last thing, too, on the slide notes that Edmund Burke expresses some skepticism with regard to the optimism associated with the Enlightenment. So he is not necessarily certain that human beings are rational beings and will work naturally for the common good in a way that maybe Thomas Paine is more likely to see. Turning now to the situation in British North America. I'll just remind you of a few things we talked about with regard to colonial government. It's important to note that from the 1600s through the 1760s, the British citizens in North America really thought of themselves as loyal to the British monarchy. So they were not revolutionaries. However, at the same time, they were also very dependent on these colonial assemblies, and we find these in Virginia all the way up to Puritan New England. And these colonial assemblies were local legislatures that really dealt with the internal issues of the area. And so it's the colonial assemblies that pass the local tax laws, and they also provide a measure of democratic access to colonists in local government. So the colonists do remain loyal to the British Crown, and they do see the British Crown as having the function of dealing with some trade regulations, but they also turn to the British government to deal with issues of security. But they do really have a lot of dependency on those colonial assemblies and attachment to the colonial assemblies to deal with local issues such as taxation. It's when the issue of taxation comes up between the colonists and the British Parliament that we really see a breakdown in the relationship. In the 1760s, the British, for several good reasons, turned to their colonists as a source of revenue for the British Empire as a whole. They had, for example, fought a war in British North America on behalf of the colonists, or so the British thought. And so it seemed natural to turn to the British colonists for revenue, and they passed in Parliament a series of tax laws designed to get this revenue. But as we've talked about in the last slide, the British colonists in North America believed that it was the colonial assemblies who really had the right and the authority to pass local tax laws. And so there became this very heated discussion about the role of representation in taxation. The colonists did not have a representative in Parliament to speak on their behalf, and so they felt that they were getting taxed without representation. It's important to note that even during the 1760s and early 1770s, that even though many British colonists were not happy with the policies of the British Parliament, most of them were not yet willing to reject the monarchy entirely, and in fact, many were seeking some form of reconciliation with the British government. This would all change shortly. To put it simply, in January 1776, Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense. And he is really the person who begins to try to persuade, in common sense, the British colonists in North America that, in fact, it was time to throw off the monarchical form of government entirely, and that really there was no reconciliation possible with Great Britain. And so this document comes out in January 1776. It's something that's being discussed in the local taverns. It's something that's being discussed in all 13 colonies. And this pamphlet really does turn the tide from this idea that reconciliation with Britain was possible towards considerations that maybe independence was actually the best course forward. Just a few months later, July 4, 1776, Thomas Jefferson becomes the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. And as you see on the slide, I've noted that Thomas Jefferson sometimes is thought of as an American Paine, and that is because you will find many of the ideas that Paine was attached to cropping up in the Declaration of Independence. I've highlighted a few of these ideas from the preamble in red. And so one idea is this idea of unalienable rights that we are endowed with by our Creator. So not inherited rights, as Burke would like to talk about, but in unalienable rights. We also see another idea that Paine was attached to, that governments are in fact instituted among men and derive their powers from the consent of the governed. So this is not a government that is placed on us by divine authority, but the power of the government comes from us, the people. And then a third idea that's a very Painean idea is this idea that when the government is destructive of our rights, that it is our right as the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government. And of course, that's exactly what happens in the aftermath of the Declaration of Independence. We begin to fight a war with Great Britain and eventually secure our independence. What's a little crazy from my perspective is that as we are fighting the global superpower of the era, we are also trying to form our own new national government. The 13 colonies quickly form 13 state governments, but we also have to do this at the national level. John Dickinson becomes the primary architect of the Articles of Confederation, and so this is our first attempt at national government. The national government defers in many ways to the states, and each state then retains its sovereignty. The national government consists of a one-house or unicameral legislature. Again, this was the primary vehicle of power in traditional government in the colonies. And then another feature of the Articles of Confederation, in order for changes to be made, all 13 states needed to give their unanimous agreement. So changes required unanimous ratification. So even a small state like Rhode Island had as much clout as a state like Virginia. In general, we should note that the Articles of Confederation were a deliberate attempt to create a very weak national government. And this was because the people's liberty was most secured by the local and state governments. So it made no sense for American revolutionaries to try to do some sort of government structure that was large and therefore could be a threat to the people's liberty, since we were in the midst of fighting for that liberty as this Articles of Confederation was being written. Right. So what does it mean to be Republican is one of the primary questions that arises pretty early with the new government. And so it's worth noting that a Republican form of government is a government based wholly on the consent of the people. And in making the people sovereign, the states are then rejecting the prevailing view that the king or parliament should be sovereign. So they're actually making a very revolutionary move in establishing a Republican form of government. The basic premise then of a Republican government is that it demands that the people are virtuous citizens, meaning that they can act in the public or common good, putting selfish interest aside. And of course, that was a question, could we be virtuous? And that is our next slide. So, are Americans virtuous citizens? Well, it makes some sense to talk about what qualities a virtuous citizen possesses. In the 1770s and 1780s, a virtuous citizen was thought of as being a sober, moral, and industrious person, somebody who is hardworking and thoughtful. But maybe more importantly, a virtuous citizen was also an independent person, which in the 1770s and 1780s meant somebody who owned land and was therefore not dependent on somebody else for his or her livelihood, and therefore could put aside selfish interest and act in the common good rather than being persuadable by someone else. There were some, of course, who thought that adopting republicanism as a form of government was a sign of great self-confidence, but a number of Americans pointed out that the primary ingredient for virtue, the ownership of land, was something that was within the reach of many Americans because, of course, in many ways, land was our number one natural resource and was accessible. The final question that this new government had to deal with was the question of how the people would be represented. And a very real concern was the question of the balance between the people's liberty versus government power. And the way that the Articles of Confederation in particular dealt with this issue was to give a great deal of power to the people by making sure that they were well represented, particularly at that state level and even to some degree at the national level. But the government remained suspicious of executive power and aristocracy to a point that, in fact, the Articles of Confederation didn't even include an executive branch. They were so suspicious. Well, there's no need for a spoiler alert because clearly we don't live under the Articles of Confederation. So definitely some problems arose very quickly in the early years of the Articles of Confederation. There were a series of crises that convinced folks that we needed to tame our revolutionary vision. There was evidence, for example, of a lack of civic virtue. In some states, for example, there were tax laws being passed that some people did not like, and there were rebellions such as Shays' Rebellion. There was also a lack of civic virtue among the states as they bickered over the boundaries in the west of their states, and they began to tax each other in terms of goods being imported across state lines. So it These kinds of issues convince folks like Alexander Hamilton of the need for greater security in a much stronger central government. By 1787, then, a number of folks were convinced of the need to revise the Articles of Confederation. Delegates met in the summer of 1787 to do just that. Over the next several months, proceedings of these delegates were kept secret. Nobody in the press knew what was going on, and therefore the American public was very much in the dark about what the delegates were discussing, but at least theoretically, they were revising the Articles of Confederation. Therefore, at the end of these proceedings, when the delegates emerged, folks were really surprised when they emerged not with the revised Articles of Confederation, but instead with a whole new constitution that departed from the Articles of Confederation in a number of key ways. The Constitution that emerged tried to deal with the perceived deficit in civic virtue. And it did so by creating a national executive and judicial branch in addition to the legislative branch. That gives you a little bit more force and centralization of power. There was also a replacement of the unicameral legislature with now a two-house legislature that we know as the House of Representatives and the Senate today. There was also a separation of powers and an elaborate system of checks and balances with the idea that even though we have centralized power, we're still keeping the branches accountable to each other, and no branch can achieve tyranny over the other branches. It's also important to note that the Constitution framers were also interested in protecting the government against the power of the people and the states. And so they put in measures that allowed the people in the states to exercise power only indirectly. There's also, of course, a tremendous increase of national power, including giving the Congress the right to tax. This is not an income tax in the 1780s. It is mostly a tax on imported goods, but even still, this was a tremendous increase in the government's power at the national level. When the Constitution emerged, many people were very unhappy. One of them was Patrick Henry of Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death fame. He, of course, criticized the new government as a vehicle for wealth and power rather than as a vehicle for liberty. He gave a very long speech on that issue. And then the other major objector was George Mason, who we will read in the Anti-Federalist papers. He was critical of the new government on several fronts. The most powerful critique was that it contained no declaration of rights. As the states had created their own 13 state governments, each state had created a state declaration of rights. George Mason noted that with the increase of national power, that it was probably in order to create a national Bill of Rights of some kind, and he would have liked to have seen that added. There are also several other criticisms, including that there was not enough representation in the House of Representatives, the Senate had too much power. He was concerned about the relationship between the federal courts and the state courts. He was very critical of the executive branch and the creation of a single executive in the form of the president, which looked suspiciously like a king. He was concerned about not enough separation of powers, and he was critical of many of the discussions that had happened around the issue of slavery and that there was too much capitulation on that issue. In the face of many of these legitimate objections to the Constitution in terms of its specific features or even its creation as a whole, someone like Alexander Hamilton, who I've labeled an American Burke, along with his counterparts James Madison and John Jay, decided that they really needed to explain and defend the Constitution against such criticisms by way of the New York newspapers. And so these Federalist Papers are designed to answer the objections of people like George Mason and even Patrick Henry, and explain why, in fact, the Constitution preserves folks' liberty and is actually a really good idea. Hamilton, for example, in the very first Federalist paper, will ask critics whether we are able to form a new government from reflection and choice. And so it's really a call to let us really reason this out. And he's concerned that the Anti-Federalists are maybe relying on passion and emotion. And so he presents himself and the other Federalists as having a rational approach to government. Hamilton will also defend the Constitution by saying that this vigor in government is actually essential to the security of liberty. And this in some ways sounds a little bit like what we've heard from Edmund Burke, who points out that democracy and liberty can't exist in a vacuum, and it's important to establish a context for order so that, in fact, liberty can flourish. And then, of course, Hamilton will say in that first Federalist paper that the Constitution is, in fact, the safest course for your liberty, your dignity, and your happiness. And again, this is echoing this idea that in a time of chaos and disorder, liberty is compromised. To conclude then, coming back to the question of whether the United States in its political foundings was radical or conservative, I would point out that some of the ideas of Paine that live on from the Articles of Confederation through the Constitution include the fact that the United States does remain republican in terms of the form of government. It does not become a monarchy, and so in that sense, it is a radical revolution. The Constitution is also very clear in rejecting titles of nobility. So, again, anti-aristocratic. Paine would also have been happy to see that the principle of equality that is enshrined in the Declaration of Independence translates into greater voting rights by the early 1800s, at least for white men, as the property requirement tends to go away by the 1820s and 1830s. So there is a motion, there is something set in motion, at least through these ideas. Then, of course, because of the arguments of people like George Mason, we do actually see a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. The Federalists win in the sense that the ratification of the Constitution happens without a Bill of Rights added, but the Federalists do compromise on the issue of the Bill of Rights by making sure it's one of the very first things that the new American Congress discusses and adds to the Constitution. And this, of course, becomes almost a sacred part of our political identity. And again, that's probably largely thanks to the Anti-Federalists. We also, of course, have a separation of church and state, and that is also something that Paine would have very much embraced. A couple of questions that remain, however, are things about the balance between security and liberty. And these are questions that we've asked in every generation, and we will, I'm sure, continue to ask. I think, too, a key American question that we have struggled with since the beginning is this acknowledgement that there is a paradox at the heart of our political institution between ideals of freedom and the protection of the institution of slavery. Many of you already know that our founding fathers were slave owners, many of them, and yet still talked about the importance of freedom. So this is something that we've had to live with.